Hola, muy buenas noches a los que estamos aquí, bueno, en Brasil, Argentina. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a más un encuentro de este seminario Bolívar versus Monroe, un seminario que busca debatir pues, el proyecto imperialista de Estados Unidos en el marco de los 200 años de la doctrina Monroe. Este es un seminario organizado por Alba Movimientos, por el Instituto Simón Bolívar de Venezuela, Internacional de los Pueblos y por el Instituto Tricontinental de Investigación Social. Así que todos los jueves, este es el segundo encuentro y hasta el 6 de julio, en este mismo horario, tendremos entonces a cada jueves un nuevo encuentro para debatir temas distintos pero relacionados pues tanto con el proyecto del imperio.
Both the imperialist project toward Latin America and also the forms of resistance and the proposal of an alternative project based on Bolivarian ideas, based on social movements, including several governments who are attempting to create this more equitable Latin America. This second session is talking about land reform versus large estate. So today we'll have the participation of Guillermo Barreto y Carlos Ron from the Simón Bolívar Institute of Venezuela. They're going to share some ideas on this topic. And we will also have Patricio Vertis from Argentina, who is agronomist and an expert in these topics. We were looking forward to having Johana with us, but she had something that came up that made it impossible for her to be here today. So for those of you who are listening in Spanish, you'll be listening on the YouTube channel. We also have a transmission that is in the International People's Assembly. And that's where we have the English transmission. So hopefully many people will be able to join us for this political debate about the time that we're living in, really looking at this debate around agrarian reform. So with no further delay, we're going to ask Laura to share Carlos and Guillermo's presentation from Venezuela, and then we'll have hear from Patricio as the expert who's accompanying us. And others who are here can join us in the chat, send their questions, because we'll have an opportunity to share those questions with our presenters and to be able to get their responses and answers to the questions that you send us. So now we'll have the video.
Bueno, buenas tardes, compañeras. Estamos en la
Good afternoon, companions. Here we are in the second session on this Bolivar versus Monroe seminar. And today we're going to be addressing a very special topic, which has to do with land reform, as another key element that distinguishes the Bolivarian doctrine from the Monroe doctrine. So behind us, we have a portrait of Jacobo Arbenz.
Durante los años, en los primeros años de la década de 50, que fue derrocado en el año 54 por un golpe de Estado dirigido por la CIA. Ya no es una paranoia, no es un secreto, es así. Fue la CIA la que organizó el golpe de Estado. Los aviones eran norteamericanos con el emblema tapado, y parte de la Fuerza Armada guatemalteca, que había sido formada, por supuesto, en la Escuela de las Américas, ¿no? ¿Por qué derrocaron a Jacobo Arbenz? A Jacobo Arbenz lo derrocan porque profundiza unas políticas que vienen del gobierno anterior, que tienen que ver con la reforma agraria justamente. En Guatemala había un dominio monopólico de la United Fruit Company, una empresa transnacional norteamericana que se encargaba de todo el tema agrícola. Los puertos eran propiedad de la United Fruit, los trenes eran propiedad de la United Fruit, de tal manera que todo lo que tiene que ver con las tierras, la producción y el transporte y la
That
exportación.
everything that has to do with transportation and exportation is controlled by United Fruit Company. And so Jacobo Arbenz creates a new port that is making the farming economy more independent. And he proposes a land reform program. This is unacceptable for the United Fruit Company and for the United States, which has another idea of how to interact with the world. So they organize a coup d'etat that was supported by the Organization of American States. So the problem of land has been the really essential question around Latin America, even in recent years, from centuries until now. Arbenz is not the only person who has proposed reform. There are many other cases where it has been seen to be impossible to have a true land reform because there is a giant reaction from the large economic interests, and often those interests are supported by imperialism, both by Spain or the imperialism of the United States. What's true is that this is an essential question to solve the problem, the social problems in Latin America. It's the main base of wealth. It is the source of what has really been incomplete in our countries to be able to ensure the well-being and development of our peoples. And specifically, many of the experiences, the revolutionary experience, as we were just talking about in Latin America, are really based on attempts to redistribute land. And in Bolivia, the project that they had really did have a big impact on improving the food supply of the Bolivian people. And so, there was that the Kennedy government supported a land reform where the lands that were redistributed were mostly public lands, where the large landholders who were expropriated received a huge amount of compensation for those lands. And they used those funds to buy new land and to create new spaces for large land holdings. And so there was never a real agrarian reform. In cases that are as terrible as during the Brazilian dictatorship in 1964, the Agrarian Reform Institute took it on themselves to return the land to the large holders. The simple fact of naming agrarian reform as a political project was the motive for removing Arbenz, for removing Allende, for removing presidents throughout the continent. So whenever you talk about land reform, that triggers this removal. So in the case of Venezuela, it wasn't even a true land reform. It was just an attempt to get the landholders to pay taxes. And based on that, it led to the removal of a legitimate government. So we look at Mercosur in 74. what we're really talking about is land theft, stolen from the First Nations, and to be subject to being basically enslaved to the plantations and losing their land autonomy. And this was in Venezuela. And so they call it the prison farming program, which is basically slavery that allows the accumulation of the native peoples, and that turns into feeding European capitalism as that wealth is stolen. So all the wealth goes to the metropolis. It doesn't remain in the local community.
Azúcar, cacao,
prime materials, sugar, cacao, coffee, gold, silver, and all of this destroys the accumulation of the original peoples and feeds capitalism of the European colonizers. It's not a feudal regime, but and in the center of all of this colonial development, we're talking about who owns lands, land distribution, land tenure. And so there's a real contradiction with the libertarian ideas, which is where Bolivar comes in. And so Bolivar is analyzing this problem. He sees it, and he's looking at the role of the United States. And land ownership is the base, or is the basis of the colonial economy. And so to contrast with what happened in the United States under Monroe, there are processes that happened in reverse.
Encontraron una serie de riquezas y luego concentraron la tenencia de la tierra a manera de preservarla. Lo contrario sucede en el norte, porque los peregrinos, las primeras personas que de alguna manera son las que llegan a poblar lo que fue el territorio de las 13 colonias, venían de cierta manera ya huyendo de una persecución política y una persecución religiosa. De manera que sus asentamientos eran asentamientos ya de alguna manera independientes de la corona, porque nadie los estaba de alguna manera ubicando. Y luego comienza, después de ese momento, digamos, de autonomía que les da el ser perseguidos, comienza un proceso de colonización. Ahora, un proceso de colonización donde ellos toman la tierra, no para concentrarla y para de alguna manera extraer las riquezas y llevarlas al centro, a la metrópoli, que en este caso para ellos sería Inglaterra, sino más bien toman la tierra para producir sobre esa tierra y reproducir el modelo de desarrollo capitalista industrial que está naciendo en Europa en ese momento. Entonces la idea era que ellos iban a tomar esa tierra y hacerla productiva, comenzar a producir para alimentar las industrias que iban a estar creando en las colonias del norte de los Estados Unidos. Por eso el patrón va de manera diferente. Por los años ya, luego de la independencia, de la ola de independencias suramericanas, luego por supuesto ya de la independencia de Estados Unidos, cuando se acerca más el momento de lo que es la guerra de secesión, o la guerra civil dentro de los Estados Unidos, lo que vemos es un modelo donde más bien se promueve, se incentiva, una especie de reforma agraria donde se incentiva que los particulares, las familias
the
incluso,
families.
hagan uso de la tierra. Se decreta una ley llamada la ley Homestead, que es
It
la
is the
ley
Homestead Law.
de tierras agrícolas, por decirlo así, traducción libre,
Had to do with free
donde se le da
agricultural
67, se
production.
le asigna a cada familia 67 hectáreas, con
67
el planteamiento
hectares
de
to the
que
families.
en un proceso de 5 años ellos
In
puedan
process of 5
desarrollar y
years, it will
trabajar
develop
esa tierra en función a las necesidades.
Perdón, compás,
have the
ponemos
need.
un segundo pause solo para avisarle al intérprete que está saliendo por el canal de español la traducción de inglés. Si puede silenciar el micrófono de la sala de español. Gracias.
Okay.
De
Thank you.
alimentar la maquinaria de reproducción de capital que ya venía desarrollándose en esas industrias. Fue un proceso que además,
It was a process
con el estímulo del Estado,
that was motivated by the state
a través de redes ferroviarias, a través de
by
financiamiento
building
bancario, o sea,
a railway and also bank financing.
en América Latina y el Caribe, porque mientras aquí se estaba concentrando la riqueza y no se buscaba de alguna manera que los productores pudieran hacer uso directo
Way for the producers to have access to the benefits of the land.
Se estaba promoviendo para de alguna manera alimentar y hacer crecer
And at the same time, the US was producing a
un
food
saldo.
company.
Perdón, compás, volvemos a suspender. El intérprete está saliendo la voz en inglés por el canal de español. ¿Puedes revisar, por favor? Porque se superpone la traducción de inglés con el canal de español. Gracias.
Que yo creo que es importante para nosotros pensarlo desde el punto de vista nuevamente ideológico y de cómo esto presenta
We
para
need to see how it presents
su relación con nuestros países.
in the relationship
Dentro de Estados Unidos,
with the
esa
countries.
expansión hacia el oeste,
If we see this expansion
una especie
in the United States,
derecho que
and we see it
los ciudadanos
as a right they have
abrir camino hacia el oeste, de ir cultivando esas tierras, de ir apoderándose de esas tierras, incluso en detrimento de las poblaciones nativas que vivían allí, incluso sacándolos robándoles sus tierras, sacándolos con mucha violencia, pero ellos se veían como que eso le pertenecía a ellos porque formaba parte de su proyecto. Bueno, esa barrera no...
this barrier,
Digamos, la barrera no era solamente la frontera
was
estadounidense.
not only with the borders of the US.
Para el monroísmo, la barrera era el
The barrier
continente
was the whole
entero. Por
continent.
eso es que eso nos trae un poco ya en el siglo XX,
And it brings us to the 20th
nos trae a ese momento
and
donde
21st
Estados
century.
Unidos considera que esa expansión o ese
This
derecho sobre la
expansion
tierra
or this
que tenía
right to the
en
land
el territorio
that they had in the territory,
norteamericano también lo puede ejercer en el territorio de
the Americans could not do it in the
Decía
territory
la
of our
embajadora
America.
Caitlin Fitz, como para dar un poco el razonamiento de Estados Unidos. O sea, para los del sudoeste, por encima de
For
todo,
the southeast, another more visible factor in this sectorial equation was to provide land to the white people. The United States determined in a federal policy with all the support. It was a kind of entrepreneurship that was done in family groups. A piece of abundant and rich land, maybe with the help of whatever they want to plant in it. The white people would have a land, Mexican land as well.
Esa idea que luego vemos a lo largo del siglo XX.
We saw the inclusion of this idea in the 20th century. That starts with the beginning, the entering of the Americans in Texas, and have the intervention of the US.
Todo esto es apoyado por el gobierno de los Estados Unidos.
All of this is supported by the government of the United States
La ironía sigue
in the
en la
Monroe
prensa, incluso cuando Estados
conception.
Unidos se veía a sí mismo como el líder anticolonial de un
The
hemisferio
United States would
anticolonial,
see
los
itself
pueblos
as an
coreanos
anti-colonial
tomaban
leader.
los territorios
The
cercanos
people, the
y se
government enter
aferraban a la
the
tierra, a la
surrounding
riqueza, al
territories, then
poder.
they would be in the
Eran
land
anticoloniales
to
e
wealth
imperialistas
and
al
power. They
mismo
were
tiempo.
anti-colonial
Fíjense que
and
este
they acted
decreto,
like that.
uno incluso podría verse como una reforma agraria muy democrática, la que impulsa Lincoln en esa ley de granja, ley de agrícola. Porque bueno, cada quien que quisiera, cada ciudadano que quisiera, así decía la ley, hacía la solicitud y se le entregaban sus 67 hectáreas, ¿no? Y en 5 años, bueno, si demostraba que estaba trabajando, se le entregaba un título de propiedad. Ahí están, primero, varios de los valores propios de Estados Unidos. Es el tema de la propiedad privada, la propiedad sobre la tierra.
So that has to do with ownership of land. It also has to do with citizenship, because only white people were citizens, only white men were citizens. And so what the United States was doing was a land distribution plan, an agricultural reform, but also a territorial occupation. It was the colonialism of the population. It's exactly what's happening with the Israelis in Palestine. They are displacing those who are already there. They're rendering them invisible, those who were the original owners of the land. And for many of the indigenous peoples of North America, there was no sense of ownership of land. They couldn't understand or didn't have a conception that one person could be an owner of land because it was community owned. And so it was very hard to understand, for them to process what was happening in terms of the plan of the colonizers. And so in 1862, the a law was signed. And then in 1866, there was another law that told the indigenous population that only people who are citizens have access to the Homestead Act. And so the social networks of the indigenous population were dissolved, and they were turned, and as they were turned into owners of much smaller pieces of land that really broke with their traditions and broke with their cultures, and ceding it to the white population. So for that white population, the right to land is a divine right. It's not limited to the 13 original colonies, which was the original colonization of North America, but they keep going farther and farther west. They're taking land from the indigenous communities, and they're becoming owners of that land. And, they said the white people were the ones who were going to farm the land, because they told the native peoples that because they were nomads, that you guys don't know how to work the land. You don't know how to take care of it. We do, because we're farmers. So they were completely disqualifying and the indigenous population and giving privilege to the white farmers. And they started to eliminate the buffalo population, which was the basis of the Native American economy.
Fuente primaria para las poblaciones indígenas, o sea, destruyen a la población indígena no solamente asesinándolos, sino acabando con sus fuentes primarias de recursos, como era en este caso los búfalos del oeste.
So really the buffalo were at risk of extinction.
Un proceso de exterminio, de conquista y de colonización por población, o sea, de ocupación forzada del territorio, que lo hace dueño y que lo hace además convencido de su derecho a ser dueños de esa manera. Y si son dueños de la mitad de México, son dueños de toda la parte norte, ¿por qué no del resto de América? Entonces ahí entra...
If it's not in the north, why not in the rest of the America?
O sea, ellos no van a permitir que otros...
We will not allow others to enter America.
Pero los demás no. Y para las oligarquías que se van generando
And for the
en el
oligarchy
resto de América Latina,
in the rest of the Latin America.
Heredando todos los latifundistas de la colonia, los grandes dueños de hacienda, de las plantaciones, que se aferran a su tierra, que no quieren que se lleve a cabo una verdadera independencia y que por lo tanto se hacen aliados de estas
Therefore, as allies of the government of the United States, keeping the control and the economic power.
Now, to understand in this confrontation between Bolivar and Monroe, we have to understand the role of land.
Nosotros reconozcamos también todo
We have to
el esfuerzo
recognize
que hizo
that
Bolívar por crear una reforma agraria
Bolivar's
verdadera.
interest was on having a true land reform.
Poco nos ha dado la historia espacio para estudiar el carácter revolucionario
To
verdadero.
study the character that is for real revolutionary for the Bolivar revolution. And it was divided on the divide. And I think that's something that we have to make an accent on, or like make sure to say it, because Bolivar declared in the moments of postures in 1927 the liberation of enslaved people, with also the distribution of land with soldiers, because to understand at that moment who started the revolution was the town. It was not a formal military. Is not an oligarchy that is traditional. Isn't the people with arm in them on them, and Bolivar had like he recognized that the right that those people have is to enjoy the triumph of the revolution, and is enjoying a land to develop their own way of living. And in that way, Bolivar says in the discourse, the soldiers are in response of they are people that have confronted so much danger and abandoned all their wealth, and they do not deserve to live without their value. In the name of the Republic, it was used to happen before, payment to people that were working the land, and the establishment of a commercial bank, um, and also distributing land to immigrant people. And Bolivar reject what the Congress started doing is like a formal agreement or a voucher that will give soldiers that will finish the war. They will give a title for land, because they started to exchange those vouchers instead of like going into the land and establish themselves in the land. And Bolivar reject this type of distribution, and also reject to include the bureaucrats in the state that they didn't want to work the land. And he knew that these people were bureaucrats that knew within the states, and they had their own way to make money. And that's why this distribution of land and represents it's like a very revolutionary act, because Bolivar wanted to guarantee a way for them, and like for their soldiers to have their future way of living. And Bolivar says that that it has to be proved when you were given land that those land were productive. If those lands were not productive, it will be taken of your hands the land, and it will be given to people that will want to work the land. So it was a reform that it was very revolutionary, because Bolivar will say that people didn't, or that they will create productive land, and stop that the state will take over the land and would not make it productive. And so in that way, the people from the land, and the people that were farmers, and also were indigenous people. This is something that contrasts with what we just said, with the people in the United States in 1820. And he freedom fighter talk about, and I think this is important, so I'm gonna read it. So to all these abuse that was introduced in the indigenous towns, indigenous peoples, against their own will, and against their freedom, and considering this part of the republic deserve to have the attention of the state, because these peoples were degraded, and there was a decree of making the land for families, for them to produce what was being grown for the family. So more for those who needed more. So this is pure socialism, and more for the ones who needed the most. So this land were given without being able, like, uh, to be disengaged. So this means that you cannot sell the land, and you cannot be taken out of your hands, and you have to produce on the land until 1950. And so the land cannot be given to the church, because the church was just the ones who own the most land. And in that decree, it says that then the indigenous peoples, as all of the people that are free in the republic, and they were not talking about that the indigenous people didn't deserve. They actually make it part of it, that they can do, that they have the right in the way that they choose any market, any way, and not only creating the freedom of market, but also in the way that they needed it. And this, you can see it, and in the 85th, there is a decree that in the same year in Bolivia, there is another decree that was also that the land was given to any person that was indigenous, with all these characteristics, that it will create the way for the family to sustain themselves, and the way that they wanted and needed it. That was very revolutionary, and revolutionary in ways that unfortunately was not seen in ways that the states could use it. And the state, like, just push it to their own benefit, and to gather land for themselves. And the element that you comment, Guillermo, at the beginning, that we were talking about education, and I think it's important to talk about it within the proposals from Bolivar. It is very interesting that there is part of the land that maybe there is like more family than land, and in those aspects, those lands are in a way of, like, you rent a land, and that money is used to pay the salary for teachers and within the schools that are developed in that region. So that money was directed to teachers, so to education. And so it was part of the farming and agriculture that developed freedom of market and including exportation of products. So the tragic part of this story is, as Guillermo said, this reform finally was not executed because of the interests in different republics that were built, and that he was being able to legislature. So this is a reform that is not executed as he was saying, and so the program was not implemented in the way that he put it out, and it reflects some of the stress that he had. And the law of repartition of land is for all Colombia, and good or bad, and it's for everyone. And there was like a distinction from one to another, and there was some reform that were done in the law. I haven't seen it, but there was a new parts that would make fun of what I put out first, where soldiers were given land, but then they sell it to the ones that had more money. And the stress of Bolivar was that the land was for those who fought for the independence, that had the capacity to develop their own life in the future. And that Bolivar said that there is the freedom is close, and it's the time that the soldiers will come back home. And so if they will come back home without a security, it would not be strange to be as the way of Spaniards after they came back from Venezuela. And he said that this, hopefully this is not a civil war that would be shown here because of the population. And Bolivar ends with a lot of frustration, seeing that this project was not like executed how he thought. And he said that I'm afraid more of peace than war. And with this, I end.
Bueno, darle muchas gracias a Guillermo.
So I would say thank you to Guillermo and Carlos from the Institute Bolivar to bring us this historical perspective and counter reform of agriculture, and how
de cuán central es la cuestión agraria, ¿no? La tierra es algo central en los proyectos de dominación porque
we have really seen how land is central to the domination projects because its political, social importance for the economic importance. And so this brief review of history has really made it very clear, this central role. And it's really helped us to understand a little bit more about the land reform, the revolutionary land reform that Bolivar has as a proposal. So again, for those who have recently come, you're very welcome here at this second seminar in the Bolivar versus Monroe series, which we're looking at 200 years since the Monroe Doctrine and 200 years of resistance to imperialism. And so today we're talking about agrarian reform versus large estate holdings. So I am part of the landless people's movement in Brazil, and I want to send a greeting to all of those who have mentioned that they're here in the chat. There are people here from Argentina, Ecuador, Cuba, Brazil, and I imagine there are many other places represented as well throughout Latin America, throughout the world, because we are broadcasting with interpretation in English through the People's Assembly YouTube channel. So for the second part of this session, we had planned to hear from Johana, who is a lawyer, a specialist in land conflicts and land reform, but she had another commitment or something that came up. So in her place, we have Patricio Vertis, who is also an expert in agrarian topics, and he's going to talk to us about the current situation in the region on this topic. So I'd like to turn it over to Patricio now. So good afternoon, good evening. Very grateful to those who have invited me as a substitute. And so I just want to add a couple points on land reform. And looking at some workshops that we gave a few years ago with some companions. Can you hear me fine? Seems like. So what is land reform? We're going to share a PowerPoint presentation. Share the screen. So if we're going to talk about land reform, we have to talk about two elements. If we look at the next slide, move on to the next slide. So we have to go back in time to the process of conquest. So when the Spaniards arrived in what is now Latin America and the Caribbean, they really unleashed genocide, displacement, and the expropriation of land from the native peoples. And as a product of this genocide and this displacement, it was possible to take over the land for farming purposes. And that's the starting point for the process of the need for land reform in Latin America and the Caribbean. And then the second point has to do with the issue of the largest state holdings. The land problem in Latin America and the Caribbean since the conquest until the beginning of the 20th century has been the largest state land holdings. In every country in the American continent, this is the main problem. It generates a question of humanism, which really huge swaths of land that are directly connected to very small parcels of land that are assigned to different social relationships that are like servanthood, semi-feudal, slavery. I mean, there's lots of discussion or debate around the terms, but there's this problem of the social relations that are created. And so these large estate land holdings were assigned to sectors of the colony that had to do with the head of the military, that had to do with these processes of military campaigns, advancing the petit bourgeois, that really were the nucleus that later became elite forces. We're talking about the
sectores también
military leaders, we're talking about
a la Iglesia Católica y
religious
comerciales.
and the merchant class.
Un vínculo muy fuerte y un lugar privilegiado en las direcciones de los estados nacionales.
And so there were also a lot of donation processes that had to do with the aristocracy, and they had a real central position in these nation states that were being born. And they really were not confronted throughout most of our history. And we're going to pass to the next slide. And there's a moment in the 20th century where there's an intensification of the fight for access to land and the process of land reform. And so we're talking about in certain decades of the 20th century. It doesn't mean that didn't happen previously. They were talking about what happened in Venezuela in the age of Bolivar, in the Haitian Revolution that did propose a land reform process, and also in Uruguay. But the bulk of these processes for land reform really took place in certain decades of the 20th century. But before we go more deeply into that part of the topic, we need to ask ourselves, what is land reform? We understand it to be any process of transformation in the pattern of use and ownership of land and access to land. Any change in this pattern of exclusion or inclusion. And so we also understand land reform to include those transformations that seek to create more equal access to land. We need to transform these patterns of inclusion of access to land so that they're more equitable. So that's the basic concept. So if we want to talk about why for so many years there was not an intensification of land reform processes in general, and why it mostly took place in the 20th century, we have to talk about what happened during that historical period to generate the conditions. First of all, there are a series of general causes. There is an assessment. I'm going to really simplify it a lot. We're talking about a lot of countries around the region. It's a lot, but I'm going to try to simplify it so we can understand it more clearly. So in this period of the 20th century, there was a shared assessment by many sectors of society in different spheres and different political areas around the approach to economy, that they were seeing that there was a real holding back of the process of development in the economy, and especially around land. So one of the economic problems that really talks about this backward nature of development really had to do with a stagnation of the economy. So why does that happen? There is an agreement as well in that period that in great swaths of non-large estate landholdings that included a lot of the most fertile farmland that was not being worked. And this is an agreement that there's a fairly broad consensus on that aspect. And also there started to be problems in terms of how the agrarian societies were being shaped. There started to be a lot of debate around the unjust structure or unjust exclusion around land tenure in our countries as a consequence of agricultural structures that were previous to the independence of our countries, that had to do more to do with the colonies. And so there starts to be a debate around that topic. So why does this discussion happen not until the 20th century? Because the traditional aristocracies during this historical period started to feel questioned about their privileges in society. It starts to be discussed, and their role and their structures in the agricultural structure starts to be questioned and starts to be challenged. And so there's a series of aspects, and I'm just going to mention 4 that feed into this gradual process of being able to question the legitimacy of the landholders. So there's an increase in the level of social conflict between landholders and other social sectors, small farmers, leaseholders, family farmers, rural landless workers. And this really starts to steal legitimacy from the aristocracy. Second, we start to see other social groups become involved, intellectuals, seeing what's happened in the Cuban Revolution, sectors of parts of the Catholic Church. In third place, starting in the 1959 Cuban Revolution, a real problem starts to be posed for the dominant classes in Latin America with a threat that comes from the springing up of other revolutions that are inspired by the Cuban Revolution. So this becomes a real concern for the elite. And they really see this with a lot of worry and concern that there seems to be a development of insurgent processes in many different countries. And so in 1961, President Kennedy proposes the Alliance for Progress project. And in this project, the proposal is to cede to the pressure for access to land and land reform to put a brake on these other incipient revolutionary processes. And we'll take a look at the kind of land reform that was involved there. We'll look at that a little bit in the future when we talk about the Alliance for Progress. And the fourth element would be the accelerated expansion of small farmer movements that really unleashes an organizing process unprecedented in the rural areas that really leads to a leadership and a centrality in political processes that they hadn't had before. And so these are the most general causes that make it possible to have an intensification of land reform processes in certain decades of the 20th century. And if we analyze the land reform process, we realize that these processes have taken place in very different contexts in our different countries, different ideological situations. There have been land reforms that have been promoted by populist governments, by revolutionary governments, by centrist governments, by reactionary governments. There's a huge range of ideologies behind these different processes. And if we analyze these processes, we have to take a look at how they are proposed in these different scenarios under different governments, under different political visions. We can look at what are some of the variables in these different processes, talking about it has to do with how deep or how effective they are. And through these variables, we understand the nature of the processes of land reform. So first, we can look at the amount of land that is distributed. The total amount of productive or farming land used. We're looking at really widely variable ranges. We can look at the number of campesina or small farmer families that benefit from it. We can look at the process of liquidating the largest state land holdings. And there are land reform processes that coexist alongside large amounts of land that are still held by large estates. Another variable is the way that the land is expropriated. If we're talking about only public lands, if they're private lands that are purchased, if there's a process, an expropriation process that doesn't provide compensation. Another variable is the duration of the process. Some are much more extensive than others in terms of the length of time. Another is the kind of political system. You can also look at the forces that are driving it, whether they're coming from below, are they bottom up, or are they top down? If we talk about bottom up, we're looking at various sectors of society that come together to put pressure for the land reform to take place.
Imponiéndole a determinado gobierno un proceso de reforma
And in some ways, requiring or forcing a government to follow through with that process, versus those kinds of processes that are spearheaded by government cupolas or government leaders that would be a top-down process. So talking about government engineering, and in some cases it's the reverse, where there's a real increase or upsurge in struggles for land control that feeds into that conflict. And then we can look at what's the legal form of distributing land. Are they collective lands? Is it government land? When you analyze any land reform process based on these variables, you can have a more comprehensive analysis of the nature of the process of each of the processes. So we have a few more minutes. I'd like to comment that there are different kinds of land reform processes.
How long I have? I'm gonna speak very fast. And there are different types of land reform. And when we did this workshop, we based on a book. I'm gonna show it here, the experience of a land reform. And that was from Choperi Steri, that was from Brazil. And that was from something that was put out in this book as different ways of land reform. And there are 7. And what came in Caribbean and the Latin American was land reform, classic, anti-colonial land reform, radical land reform, popular, and partial modern land reform. And there is not enough time to talk about all of them, but maybe there are pictures that you can skim through and stop right there. In our America and the American continent, in the place that was developed was in the United States. And the other that was in the United is not only in the United States, but later in Europe and later Asian countries. The next and the anti-colonial land reform. And this is the place where independence of our countries, and people talk about Paraguay, Uruguay, Haiti, and the central motive was taking land from the colonizers and distribute them, and in the way of like popular revolts. The next is the radical land reform, and it will talk about the within the framework go on in Mexico and revolutionary places where in Bolivia in 1954, and it was imposed by people from the indigenous people, and it was called like that because it was people from it was the people who took arms on their hands and to make sure to redistribute the land and to take it from the colonizers. And next, and the next one more, please. And the popular land reform, which is in our Americas, in Nicaragua, Cuba, and in general, it was impulsed by alliances of popular governments, socialist governments, and popular people from the land. And it was given to people that would work the land and also people that were indigenous people. And it was to institutionalize, later on, it was institutionalized, and it was put into people's land. And the next, one more. And the partial or modern land reform, it was the one who predominated the most in our countries, and it was centrally in the 60s and 70s, as we were talking before, from the Cuban Revolutionary. It was there was a reform from the progress and start to try to stop these revolutionary movements, and it proposed to the elite, local elites, and to push these partial or modern land reform and to move the development, and it was from different laws, and it was not a very significant. It was like very little farmers who were benefiting from it, and there was part. It was benefiting only a few peoples, and as as I was saying, Ecuador, Costa Rica, Panama, Honduras, Guatemala, and in Chile and Peru is more radical and is within, but is within partial and modern land reform. And if you see these processes, we're not able to transform deeply these land reforms. And I'm gonna close because I only have 1 minute to talk about a few things. Next, please. Next. I think this is the last one. You will say here pictures from different type of land reform. As I was saying before, because of the lack of time, I thought about three different ways. In first, when we are talking about land reform, is we talk about the 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 large state land holdings. And one question about these large state land holdings: who owns it? Is it like colonizers? In what way? For what is it like updated for today? Is there like other people, finances, and or commercial? Who are the ones who has a large portion of our land, and how big today they have land? Secondly, what are other problems that have the largest state land holding till today? And there was critics to these largest state land holdings today, that they were not productive, that they were inefficient, and we should revise these in these processes. That there is other problems that we can see. And in third, who are the social groups or alternate in within today, and what are the space that they occupy? What more than the farmers? Then in some places it's a very strong, it's a debate. uh, Apart from that sector, who are the other subaltern social groups, informal or formal or informal, smaller productive uh, farmers? We think that those people were benefited, or were part of uh, some part of like revolution of like land reforms. I'm so sorry if I extended myself, and thank you so much. Thank you to you, Pato Patricio Ortiz from Argentina. And Pato left us with like a lot of questions that we can reflect on, and in the topic of the land in our from our territories, and also through chat that people from Puerto Rico and Panama, um, people that I mentioned before, that I wanted to talk about it. So Carlos and Pato could talk about, apart from what Pato's questions. And in this space of capitalism, the expropriation of land is one of the ways, or how can we think about this process of land reform today? Another question was what elements are can a move social movement can bring to the sovereignty, and what is the relationship with food sovereignty? And another question is that is there a way of land or reform to think about more social ways? And we want to talk about this in these last few minutes. I think maybe we can start with Carlos. Yes, thank you, Ana. I will say that starting from the last, yes, it's a social justice. Yes, we cannot see this land problem of the concentration of the land. It keeps being the inheritance from the colony and these structures of concentration, that that it reflects all the social agenda that is still hasn't been accomplished yet. And we don't have to divorce that cause of social of justice, of the land reform, of the important transformations, and also up till today, as Pato was saying, with all this transformation around the land and the power structure, from the imperialist vision, there are still formulas that can make changes, but they are not deep changes, and they are not part of like a long-lasting change. As Pato was saying, and the alliance of to the progress, and as Kennedy was saying, and that was a reaction from a deepest reform that maybe could be contagious in that region. A little time ago, it was like Biden proposed like another one and that also like changed bits from it, but it imperialism knows that concentration of land generates different type of social distortions, and there is like different interests to resist those changes, and they will open escape valves, and that they're like partial or moderate is like part of our um, social justice movement. The land tenor keeps defining our social status because that brings like status and wealth. And I think here from Venezuela that we can speak more freely and more knowledgeable. Here is a flag that is very important from the largest state landholders. And Chavez started in 2001 with a reform that regenerate or generate the started the coup d'etat in 2002. The laws were approved in 2001, and 2002 there was almost a coup d'etat. And Latin Americans started to do a land reform. Then there is like a biggest coup d'etat intent, and till we talk about the land reforms, we cannot talk about social change, and that will make happen, that will bring any change in Latin America. Pato, I couldn't hear the last question. I have something to say. If you can talk about, if you can repeat the last one. What are the elements that can support in social movement to build part of the sovereignty of countries? And what is the relationship with this general relationship with the sovereignty with the food sovereignty? And I'm going to talk about that one. I don't know if in Argentina, I know in Argentina, I don't know in other places, there is a divorce between the food sovereignty and the sovereignty in bigger scale. It's not completely divorced, but it's not necessarily tied together with that, like tied with bigger scale of food sovereignty and the sovereignty in general, maybe by the sectors that hold the discourse of each one of the sovereignties. And I think it's very necessary to see these in a more integral way. The food sovereignty or all of the sovereignties are more tied together. And I think it's important to talk more about it.
Tanto de esos ingresos después para cualquier otro tipo de políticas, a veces
We really depend on these other income for the processes that we're doing here in Latin America. But in my opinion, they really should attempt it. So in terms of expropriation of land and options, current options, and of course it is an option. Obviously, there are certain sectors of the economy that could develop new companies, new enterprises, even though there are existing enterprises in the farming sector. The increase of scale, it means that there's new efforts are needed, because where one establishment grows, it starts to reach a limit, and it starts to think about creating entrepreneurial units where we have that just keep increasing the amount of surface area that they need to use. So we're looking at this link between large estates and the rest of economic units, the rest of small, medium, of all different other sizes. So obviously, this requires building in terms of organizational structure with a political objective that includes many different sectors that have the capacity to bring this debate to the front. As Carlos was saying, smaller debates around what regulations and monitoring imply, they're very sensitive topics where beyond the true amount of land that's being held, they have a huge lobbying power. They are able to put themselves on the public agenda, to take over space in the media, and so they have a disproportional impact on the debate. There's a social force that is very significant. And so I could concur with Carlos that land reform is really talking about a very asymmetric use of land. And it's clearly a problem of social justice, as well as a farming problem, a productive problem, an economic problem. But it really is strongly in the camp of social justice, because today there are very large estates that are productive. You know, maybe in other time periods, they were inefficient, they were not being exploited. But I'm going to leave it there for now. And I really appreciate the invitation to be here. Thank you so much. Thank you, Pato. Thank you, Carlos. This is a topic that we could be here for many hours with bringing lots of questions. In Brazil, it's a very central question for us, for the landless people's movement and for Brazilian society. And we do have this proposal of a popular land reform as the route to be able to face these huge dilemmas of humanity, the central questions that today are being experienced in our countries, in America, Latin America, and all over the world. And so land reform, without land reform, it's really not possible to solve the problem of hunger, the problem of social justice, the question of the environment. All of that has to come from land reform. And of course, the question of urban issues that are very connected due to the lack of healthy food production. Undoubtedly, it's a question that we need to continue debating, and we're going to continue doing it out of our political training schools, all of our international coordinations, thanks to the centrality of this issue. So thank you so much for being here with us for the last hour and a bit. This is our second session of this seminar that takes place every Thursday. The first one was last week, and it will keep going until July 16th will be the last one. June 15th is the next session. And we will again have the participation of the Simón Bolívar Institute, along with other colleagues from the United States. So from ALBA movements, from the Simón Bolívar Institute of Venezuela, for the Social Research Center, and the International People's Assembly. We wish you all a good evening. And we really appreciate that you could join us from your battlegrounds in the space of each of you, so that you can join this debate around the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine and the 200th anniversary of the resistance movements in Latin America. So thank you, and until next Thursday.